So just leaving a little bit of buffer right here at the beginning. And three, two, and one. And welcome to the show, Siri. For folks who have not tuned in to Siri's podcast before, Siri Plouff is the host of A Heathen's Journey and is the author of the upcoming book Queering the Runes. Welcome to the show, Siri.
Yes, thank you. It's so good to be here.
So to kick this off, um, I thought it'd be interesting to ask, what is your favorite rune?
This week, today, this moment, I would say I was actually just reading about Dagas this morning, and so that one is definitely on the brain a little bit. I think that Dagas is really interesting because back up, Siri. Okay. So I've been thinking a lot about runes in pairs because it was an exercise that I think it was kind of kicked off by an exercise that James, who I'm co-teaching the Intro to Elder Futhark through Fellowship of Fire and Ice, kind of was talking about runes in pairs and like how do they work together in those energies. And so I've been thinking a lot about Dagas and Soolo as both being solar and day oriented runes, but then also I've been thinking about Dagas and Yera as time oriented runes. Um, and so I'm just kind of noodling around about that right now, and it's lovely because it's also I see Dagas as a rune of transformation and a rune of kind of integrating many things together, and the debate around whether it goes last or second to last in the Futhark as well, I think is it's just a curious little thing. It's just kind of I think it's kind of up to every rune reader to determine for themselves what makes sense. And I find that a funny little thing.
What first brought you to runes and rune work?
So I have a circuitous path. When I was younger, I was originally trained in a Wiccan coven, and the priest and priestess worked with Norse gods and goddesses, and so they also worked with runes. And so we used runes a lot magically, kind of like to amplify ritual work and stuff like that, but they were very much outside of the context of heathen and Nordic practice. Um, and so I was kind of like, oh, well, these are interesting, but they're not really like super my thing. And I talk about this in the book a little bit, I um was doing a later as I was a solitary practitioner, I was doing a um I want to meet a goddess ritual, and just like Odin shows up like, hey girl, hey, here we are. And so I was like, you're not Odin, you're just a spirit calling themselves Odin. I don't believe in god or gods or goddesses. What am I doing here? Not, I was a mess. I was in my 20s, it's fine. And I kind of started pulling out more rune related information, kind of digging deeper into Nordic mythology, and found that to be really beautiful and surprising and startling in a lot of ways, because I never thought that I would really connect with it because of the kind of prevailing perception of Norse mythology as very like masculine, which I get into a lot in the book as well. It is not, in such a simple, easy way as people think of it or, label it. Um, and then ultimately, like, I kind of got to a place like where I was sharing more of my spiritual path online, and came into conversations about cultural appropriation. And I was like, like I want to dive more into my own ancestral culture and boy, has that been a transformative experience. And so the runes were kind of like my, all right, we're going in hot, kind of thing. So yeah.
One thing I'd like to turn to particularly is what you mentioned as the image of masculinity. Like, what do you think, where do you think that comes from for like how people talk about Nordic material and stuff that's related to it?
I mean, I think a lot of it kind of comes from the, hang on, I'm going to start that sentence over again. I think a lot of it comes from the white supremacist appropriation of runes and Nordic magic and myth. And with that comes very prescriptive gender roles, because that's one of the ways that white supremacy and gender, intersect, is through these kind of, I'm going to say quote unquote traditional um binaries of masculine and femininity and polarity and like all of that stuff. And, the idea of the Vikings as people are so obsessed with Vikings and with Viking history. And I find that really interesting now that I've like kind of done a lot of my own explorations, because we're really talking like a 400 year span of time, and it's just pirate LARPing, really, I
Yeah.
think is a huge part of why people are interested in that. And I mean, like a lot of the literature kind of is, directly coming out of that era. So if we're, you know, being inspired by the great myths of, the prose and poetic Edda, these things being written down like at the tail end of the Viking era. So a lot of people are placing it aesthetically in their minds, in that era. But like there's a whole fascinating history before, and there's a whole fascinating history of Nordic culture after the Viking era. Um, and so I think it's really this like tension. And so then people kind of glorifying the Viking era as, an era of exploration and, where I would say colonization, I think other people would say badassery. Um, I think there's like that kind of perspective happening too. In the book, I do go into a slight tangent in one chapter, about the role of aesthetics in politics and the role of aesthetic in determining, kind of spiritual interest in a lot of ways. And I think that people really cling to that Viking image when, as I also talk about in the book, like gender roles were just straight up different, and in that era and previous eras and even in early Christianity, like gender roles were just different. We don't know what they were. We can kind of guess. You can look at graves and realize like, oh, like there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here, that doesn't necessarily show like a biological sex of the person who was buried. um for anybody who wants to go down that rabbit hole, um there was a really good episode on the Nordic mythology podcast recently with a gender archaeologist scholar. And it was very delightful because she was kind of bringing up all of these points of like, oh, well, like the way that people are sexing these graves is, that if there's a sword, it's a man's grave, but that's just us with our perception of gender, like putting it on the skeleton, and you can't actually like know the, biological, like the body of the person like in that grave as easily as all that. And so, people will say, oh, there were very few shield maidens, when actually they could, like we don't know that
Mhm.
because people just assumed if there was a sword, it was a man.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I
and
think there was even a recent study in on like bodies they found in like what was the Danelaw, where they re-examined a bunch of the bodies and went, oh wait, a lot of these are not anatomically male, even though they've
yeah,
been labeled as
yeah.
such.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, there's a lot of really interesting work happening in academia right now, and there has been for, gosh, even since the 90s around gender in, this era and, earlier. Um, and it's just really, yeah, and so I think that that is something I really wanted to tease apart in the book, and also something that I wish I had done better in the book. Um, but that is truly why there's never just one book, and you're always growing, and why scholars will often go back and, critique their earlier work or what have you. There's always room for growth. There's always room for the research. There's always room for discovery.
And turning to the book, the title is Queering the Runes, which I think is something that really jumps out as like it's really announcing what it is that it's going for. Could you unpack that a bit more as to what it is that you mean by both the title as well as like the idea of queering the runes?
Yeah, so queering the runes, it was really refreshing to just like this book just does what it says on the tin. It's queering the runes because my previous book, my co-author Cassandra and I joke that we just like Trojan horsed a lot of queer theory into a book about tarot and creativity. Because we're both like queer and like want it that ends up seeping into everything that we write. So it's like in that book as well. So that was very deliberate. This actually the entire book probably started 7 years ago as a way for me to try to find myself in what I had assumed was a very masculine, very cis het, you know, set of divination, um, which I quickly found was not the case at all. I pitched that as an article series for a blog called Little Red Tarot. And that became the Heathen's Journey, which then when Little Red Tarot shut down their community blog, um, it became the Heathen's Journey podcast. And I just kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper and finding more and more that I wanted to say about all of these. Um, so I talk about in the book how there are actually two different definitions of queer, right? So there we have this thing is queer, this thing is strange. Um, but we also, which is sort of the adverb, right? What a queer little man. Um, but we also have the verb usage of queer, which is to take something, and I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm kind of going to just go through this definition really quick. But basically, to use queer as a verb is to take something and bring forward that which is subversive and hidden, and in particular as it relates to gender and sexuality. It comes directly from, queer theory, queer literary theory, um, but also just from the work that queer people have been doing for, as long as we've been around, right? And so queering something could be like, um, well, in the book, Queering the Runes is I'm looking at a rune and I'm looking at the rune, and I am looking at the um different ways that this rune could be interpreted in subversive ways, particularly as relates to gender and sexuality. But I do also talk a lot about, kind of more collective identities versus capitalistic identities and ways of being in the world. I do kind of touch a lot of other sorts of modes of being. And I also ask in the book, I'm also kind of challenging people to, see the queerness of something that is not necessarily queer, right? So like I do still talk about urus as, in relation to Audhumla, right? I do still talk about these kind of more um not queer like interpretations of the runes, but guess what? It's all gay. It's all queer. It always has been. It's that meme of the astronaut staring at the earth and then the other asking like, "Oh, has it always been queer?" Or, "Oh, wait, it's queer." And then the other astronaut is like pointing a gun at them being like, "It always has been." It's kind of like that, right? So that is the action that I'm trying to take with the work, is to make this an accessible resource for people for whom, um, cishet interpretations of particularly gender, femininity and masculinity within runes are often talked about, ways that we often talk about sexuality, um, in the medieval, ancient, ancient to medieval and up through, very recent times. Um, yeah, and kind of bring some of that forward. If there's one thing that I would do is I would go harder. I would make it gayer. Um,
What are some particular examples from history and myth that help build the foundation of this work for you?
yeah, so I think that myths of Loki are really, a good solid foundation that a lot of people from outside of the like weird queer little section of heathenry that I kind of exist in might know, Loki turning into a mare and then um tempting the other stallion away and becoming pregnant. And Loki doesn't just like, have a child with the stallion. Loki like births the stallion. Like Loki is the mother of um the eight-legged horse, whose name I'm suddenly blanking on. Brain fart. Um,
Sleipnir.
Sleipnir, yes, thank you. Oh my God. So embarrassing. Yeah, so Loki is Sleipnir's like mother, but like we wouldn't look at the myths and say, oh, Loki is, a woman. Loki's very much a transformational figure. Um, there's also Odin as a queer figure is fascinating to me because he's not one that a lot of people will kind of gravitate to and latch onto as a queer figure. Um, Loki, I almost exclusively use they them pronouns for, by the way. Or I try to almost exclusively use they them pronouns for them just because that makes sense in my brain. Like, why make them choose? You know,
They,
why make Loki
they really
his
seem to, choose depending on what feels best in the moment, really.
right, which is a very like beautifully gender fluid way of being. Odin I do tend to use he him pronouns for, even though he does perform a lot of, you know, magic that is considered feminine. Odin learns Seidr from Freya, but he has to learn it from Freya because it's, a very like it's considered a very feminine mystery. And so his lineage of learning kind of comes through her. And that is one of the signifiers of, gender, that a lot of people are looking at in the mythology. Odin also canonically takes the bottom role in sex with other men, or sex with men. Like it is very explicitly called out when he and Thor are essentially slinging, in their like game of wits, slinging insults at one another. Thor refers to him as Ergi, and Thor, which Ergi in the Old Norse is a a derogatory word often for the man who is the bottom in um gay cis male sex. Um and of course the tops were like, oh, it's fine. I'm still, like super manly. But as one of my favorite podcasts that I don't know if they'll ever update this, but one of my favorite podcasts is Vikings Are Gay. And there's an entire episode about bottom shaming and Viking culture. And I just love it. Eat it up. So we know that Odin will basically sleep with anyone. I mean, we've got this like chaotic bisexual, like kind of a queen in that he's like willing to bend like gendered expectations in order to gain wisdom, or it's very cunning of Odin in a lot of ways, right? Um, there's also the long held tradition of utilizing humor and gender in like a humorous way. Um, and I'm thinking very explicitly about when Thor needs to dress up as Freya and pretend to marry the ogre in order to retrieve his hammer. And in my brain, it's always just like kind of played for laughs a little bit that like Loki goes with Thor, but we all kind of know that Loki could just like probably transform to look almost exactly like Freya, right? But
Hmm.
no, this is Thor. Thor has to do it. And so Loki is just kind of trying to rein Thor in a little bit and trying to be like, no, like cross your legs, honey. Like, like you have to um in my head it's always been very funny, and
Like I think you
there's a
could,
lot that we can go in there too. It
like I
feels
think,
like drag to me is what I'm trying to say. It feels like body campy drag, um which is beautiful because I think that people often overlook humor in like old texts like this.
oh yeah, like I could see if you wanted to, like if you wanted to stage it or do like some kind of enactment of that particular saga, that you could probably get the most humor just out of like Loki having to run around and go, "Oh, no, no, no. The reason why she ate all the oxen in the field is because she's been fasting. Because she wants to be ready to
Yes.
get married. No, everything's fine. Like,
Yeah. Yes, it's very like that, like it's like a montage of like gender mistakes on the part of Thor that then Loki has to go like clean up
yeah.
Thor's gender mistakes.
And also not helped by like Thor's known for like that time he accidentally lowered the sea level with his thirst. So it's like you're not supposed to be Thor right now.
Yeah, like where this is a performance, honey, like get it together. So yeah, there's a really interesting like deep basis that's just like it's really just like you just scratch the surface a little bit, and I feel like this is like gay ass, like queer as fuck, like really obviously so. Pantheon. And it's like these are the texts that survive too, right? So there's
Oh yeah.
this really interesting like reading between the lines of like, okay, these are things that were, written down at a time when, Iceland was in the process of conversion. It was after the formal conversion, which was done by vote, but then later it gets very bloody. Um, in
As
parts,
it often does.
right. Yes.
Funny that.
So whole other story. So these are the texts that are written down, in this time of tenuousness and like, oh, we have to couch, these are just like heroes. They're not gods. Like, don't worry that I'm, spreading heresy, as Snorri very clearly lays out in the introduction to the Prose Edda, right? So the fact that this much queerness survived that and is still like present and found in these texts, I think is really fantastic and kind of points to a greater like a really interesting potential for doing some personal working. And the truth is that like that era is over. We may find discoveries of manuscripts, but this was an oral tradition, so it's very unlikely that we will find other queer myths, so we have to queer the ones that we have. We're looking at these things through a queer lens because we're not necessarily going to find like um you know I mean even like we're not going to find necessarily like a novel, or well, not a novel because that's a later phenomenon, but you know what I mean? Like we're not necessarily going to find a whole new manuscript. If we did, that would be amazing.
Oh yeah.
But,
Like I
I
don't
mean,
think folks quite always grab because I feel like when you're in heathen spaces, there is this assumption of, well, we have this information, and therefore, because we have all this information, it's mostly complete. Um, Whereas like, no, 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 like leaving aside that a tiny chunk of the population even knew how to read and write to that degree to begin with, like books were really expensive. This wasn't something and delicate and like I've been in like the archive, like in like some older archives in the UK where like I wasn't working on it, but there was someone next to me who was working on like a 17th century manuscript, which was deliberately preserved because it was like shipping documents and stuff like that. And not stuffed away
right.
in the back of someone's farmhouse. And that person was having to like slowly turn each page with like a pair of tongs. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's rather than mourn the loss of potential queer, like canonical gnosis there, like I'm just like stunned with possibility, right? Which I think is a really beautiful thing about studying this, older culture, which was you can really kind of look at things through your own queer lens, and you can also like we're also now inheritors of that tradition and can um we can make new shit up, right? Like
I
to an
mean,
extent. I mean,
yeah,
like to an extent, like I mean, personal gnosis exists. It is important, right? So
yeah,
always label it as
society.
personal gnosis. But
Absolutely. Like, well, and like any society is going to be always changing and developing anyway. So,
yeah, why do we have to stay in the past? You know?
exactly. Um, how do how do you feel that the that sorry, how do you feel that sorry, trying that again. How does this core argument and the sort of core objective behind your book challenge a lot of these assumptions of like masculine coding, stuff that's sort of left over from like the romantics and also white supremacists and such, and just mainstream society mostly focusing on the thing they can, latch on to, make the most money from, um, makes a great story. Like, how does this challenge that?
In an interesting way, I'm glad that you brought up commodification because it kind of sparks for me this idea that to queer this and to kind of like actually look at these queer roots and like actually like dig a little bit deeper than the surface level of the source material um helps us to bring these myths back to the people in a way. Like yes, I'm obviously trying to get people to buy books. Please buy my books. Please, support my work as much as you can. But I'm also only one person. I'm not like, for example, Marvel, like making a lot of money off of Loki and Thor. And that's a whole other thing that I don't even want to talk about. It's
Oh yeah.
like,
Well, it's the difference
that
between we got to live in capitalism versus they're the ones who actually like pull the levers a bit.
totally. And also I would argue that the cultural artifact of Loki and Thor that are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are like almost like very different entities, even from like what a Brosta True might like see of of these myths. So yeah, there we go. Um so I do think that it's very much like we're trying to take this back. I also have for a long time wanted to position my work, and I'm always very self-critical and not totally sure if I get there. But I've always wanted to position my work as this is something that, bridges the behind closed doors, paywalled academic, very esoteric writing of academic papers as well, and makes it much more digestible because, like, all of this stuff, I mean, I even discovered in my research for this book that, like, um, Viking studies scholars have even been talking about a single gender theory since like 1996 in these cultures. So, like, why
Could
don't,
you unpack that a bit more?
yeah, so the single gender theory, and there's a lot of argument right now. It is not a set solid theory. I want to say that. Because we also now have people who are openly queer in academic circles doing this work who are like, well, actually, like this doesn't quite resonate. But the single sex theory, um, in uh Viking studies, medieval studies, but particularly like Nordic medieval studies, basically says that pre-conversion, what your biological sex is not necessarily what mattered. What mattered was power. And so instead of attributing, power to the physical body, it is attributed to the role that you take in society. And so that also opens up really interesting things and kind of broadens the perspective and helps us to understand why things like the um, extremely gender fluid, if not trans, masculine person that we know existed in the sagas was written about in the way that he was written about, right? And I will also tell that story for listeners because it's amazing and I love it so much. So basically, uh in a particular saga, um, the Heidriks og Hrafnir saga, a small part of that saga follows an ancestor uh on this, lineage. And this ancestor was born a girl, was is basically described as a tomboy in the saga itself, is kind of like this is a person who is very spirited and doesn't necessarily conform to, dainty femininity. And that's, a good thing in old Iceland. um, and so this person um basically goes on a journey to find their father's um goes on a journey to find their father's grave mound, visits the grave mound, performs some necromancy, um, has a conversation with father, is given a magical sword, and pretty much exists as a man in the Viking world thereafter. And we're talking like leading ships. We are talking like fully dressed as a man, is explicitly described as dressing as a man, to the extent that this individual's name changes and the pronouns change in how they're referring to them. It's like, no, 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 this is not this former person anymore. This is, the new man that we have. And then toward the end of this person's kind of career life, they settle down with another man and bear a child. And then that child ends up going on in the saga to have more adventures. So this is like pretty explicit. Like this is pretty explicitly a trans ancestor that we have here. Some variety. I don't know how, they would um describe themselves in a modern gendered context, right? But pretty explicit. Um,
Not exactly like fitting a hard and fast binary here.
No, no. And I'm using they them pronouns just for ease of telling the story so that I'm not switching between the two so that you can get a full picture of it. And also, unfortunately, in this moment, I am forgetting their names. Oh, it's Hereford and Her Hera. Hmm. Hereford is one of their names. Um, so there we go. Um, but yeah, so this single sex theory kind of talks about how, we're assigning power to people based on their performance of certain aspects of society. And when this person is leading a Viking ship, they are given male pronouns and, or they're given a male name and he, him pronouns. And then later, when they are a mother, um, her name reverts back and, you know, she fits into that role. Um, so, this kind of helps to potentially explain some of that transitional work and how that makes sense to someone contextually, like in the moment of the time that this manuscript was written down. But it doesn't make sense to us because now we have a biological essentialist vision of what gender is. And by we, I don't mean you and I mean society, the overculture, right? It's like, well, vagina means woman, right? Which is absolutely false and not even, doesn't even go very far back in the history of, gender in a lot of societies. So yeah, that is that single sex theory. And that was starting to be talked about in like 1996 in these academic articles and circles and stuff. And of course, people are arguing about it. Queer scholars are now talking about like, well, okay, but we do need to kind of tease this out a little bit. Like, we do still have gender fuckery. We do still have, um, very gendered language. And like, we do still want to, complicate this essentially. Right. But for me, it was just the fact that I was like, okay, I am a queer person almost 30 years later, looking into this as a part of my faith, and I'm just finding out about this now. What are we doing here? And so I've always kind of wanted my work to sort of bridge that a little bit. And I think that the one of the beautiful things about Heathen Spaces is that I think that a lot of people do that work. Um, a lot of people are very well studied. A lot of people are absolute nerds, like beasts with their, research and stuff. And it's just finding it. And I'm actually very glad, just in terms of publishing structure, that this book is at a more traditional publisher. Just for the sake of distribution and accessibility that comes with being at a traditional publisher. Um, because that's one of the issues is that I find that a lot of rune books and heathen books that are published, traditionally, um, you know, scratch the surface of really interesting ideas. And then it's a lot of independently published work that is like, ooh, yes, this is meaty. This is delicious. I want more of this. Um, and so for it to be a text that somebody who's like, oh, well, I'm interested in this, but I'm queer, so I don't know where to go. Oh, Queering the Runes, bam, like right there on the shelf of your local metaphysical shop is kind of the goal.
What would a potential next book look like?
Such a good question. Um, so it's really interesting. I've been focusing on heathenry for so long, but I'm a weird heathen. I feel like I exist in this like very weird space in heathenry. Lately, I saw a thread on Threads, um, that was like too pagan for the witches and too witchy for the pagans. And I often kind of feel that way. um, It may not be in the heathen sphere. Um, I am particularly really interested right now in the intersection of folk magic and chaos magic. Um, and I'm also very interested in discernment. How do we discernment as a tool of psychic development and awareness? So, like, I'm attempting to speak with spirits. That is a thing that on the surface of it, all of my non-witchy and non-pagan friends would be like, that's a little, you okay there, bro? Like, that's a little ooky. Like, are you sure you're talking to a spirit? Are you sure you're talking to a spirit? Kind of thing. And so I'm very interested in, like, okay, like, how exactly can we create safety for ourselves, in divination practices? How exactly can we kind of discern, yes, I am, speaking with a spirit, or, well, I could be speaking with a spirit, but maybe I'm just having an interesting thought experiment, and that is also valid, to have an interesting thought experiment, and it doesn't have to be like something outside of myself. So that's something I'm also interested in right now. Um, I also do have a background in Nordic folk magic and Nordic folk culture post Christianity. Um, so much more modern. Um, and would love to write something on that kind of contextualizes that within a broader framework of like the working folk magician today, because there are working folk magicians today. I am, in fact, one of them. Like, I do magic for other people, like for clients and stuff, and like Nordic folk traditions do just have a slightly different way of being in the world. And that I think really gets at the crux of a lot of my interests as an author, is in, okay, but what does it mean? Why? Why? And I like never really fully got out of my why phase, like as a child, like when the kid is going through the why phase and they're just like asking why the sky is blue. I feel like I've never really fully gotten out of that. And so magic is a really fascinating lens through which to explore, okay, how does the world work though? What is a soul? What are some of these deeper questions, and what does it mean that we are kind of in a space where we um believe on the surface, or in witchcraft and pagan life, we understand that transformation is something that can be directed and guided. It's not necessarily something coming from outside the self. So what does that mean about the self and the connection to everything else? um so that is my long and rambling I don't know. I need to have a lot more time to just like journal and get my thoughts together, and um to figure out what a next book looks like. I definitely have at least more than one next book in me, though. I also am working on fiction right now, so I'm very excited about working on fiction. So that may actually be the next book is fiction.
Ooh, what kind of fiction?
Um, so one of them is very deeply serious. In an okay, am I ever really serious? It's kind of serious. But it's uh, a story that I'm writing in connection with land spirits. And it has to do, there's a murder mystery, and it's an initiation story. And there's like a lot of really interesting stuff in there. However, it is a murder mystery, which means that I need to do a lot of planning and plotting, to know, like, okay, what are the hints that we're leaving? Um what's the mystery of it all? Like, what are the clues, or am I gonna leave red herrings for people, that kind of thing. The other one is a queer as hell uh sapphic werewolf romance. And that is my like we're just healing from trauma and turning into wolves. Like that is just my like that is my like I want to write, but I don't want to think so seriously about it book at the moment.
Both sound great.
Thank you. Yeah.
So there's one last question before we start wrapping up. Um, we're all sort of living in the whole hi, everything seems to be falling apart and in flux in varying levels and varying degrees. Like I think particularly like for folks in just talking to folks in the United States, and I know there's been lots of other all the things. Like we've had like something of a roller coaster in the past month and a half of history on fast forward. What is it that gives you hope in these kinds of times of so much uncertainty?
I love this question so much because I think it's so easy to just get really doom and gloom. Um, I have hope that people are going to figure it out. Just we're going to figure out on an interpersonal level how we take care of one another when, if um I have hope that we'll figure it out. So I'm based in Minneapolis. And so the 2020 uprising and COVID and all of that was really, really hugely impactful for me. Um like I literally lived like in a neighborhood where like the National Guard was staging their like tanks like on the street, like in front of my apartment. So like it was very much an experience of feeling, you know, yes, like occupied by the government and occupied by um violent state forces and policing strictures, but like there was just no mask, right? It was right there. Um and the ways that people organized to get around that um were incredible. And I played a very small part. One of the things that I participated in is in that neighborhood we had like the not shitty version of a neighborhood watch, I guess. um where people kind of organized together via Signal and Discord and were just like, okay, like, you know, like let's be up to observe if something is happening after curfew and maybe somebody is trying to come home from work and they're getting harassed by police or National Guard or something, and like alert the neighborhood. And people actually like slept in shifts for it. um People actually, and like, you know it was just fully organized by neighbors, very um mm, what's the word, decentralized. And it's also not like a story that really ever made it to the national news because it didn't need to, frankly. Like, yeah, there were a couple mornings I was up at like 3 in the morning, like looking out my window just to, make sure that everything was going to be cool and calm. And thankfully it was. Thankfully I didn't have to alert the other neighbors that anything was happening. But you know, that really gives me hope. And reflecting on that experience gives me a lot of hope. And having processed a lot of like other massive stuff that was, other big historical moments and, since then. And like, I was recently in a conversation with somebody at the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival. We were just like waiting to go into a ritual space and we kind of got to talking about anarchism. And um she's been very involved in local like pro-Palestine organizing and like protesting and camps and stuff like on her campus. Um and So it really got me thinking about like, oh yeah, like it really sucks when you're going through it, but people do come together. Um, and yes, there's fractioning and yes, there's, all of this stuff, but people really are capable of coming together and being, you know, there for each other. And that gives me hope.
So thanks again for coming on, Siri. Before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug?
Yes. So, I will be teaching a workshop on querying the runes through the Fellowship in Fire and Ice later in October. Um, so that information and registration will be at On Black Wings eventually. Um, I don't, I don't know when as of the moment of recording. Um, I also am in the process of opening up a uh witchcraft and folk magic shop in the Twin Cities. So you can follow me on Instagram at lore.books.mn. I also have a Facebook, but mainly because like Facebook and Instagram are so like deeply connected, it's just easy. Um, I you can also follow more of my like author journey at Siri.Vincent.Plouff. I have a Patreon for the Heathen's Journey podcast and some other future projects that I'm really excited about. I'm working on another podcast, a different podcast, um, which hopefully will be out later this fall. And that one will be called Chaos and Cunning. And so it's going to be kind of looking at that intersection of chaos magic and folk magic and heathenry and like all of this weird shit. Um, I also have a personal Patreon, and that is where I do a lot of my folk magic working for other people. You can hire me for like a witchcraft or folk magic consultation, which is basically like, ah, this thing feels above my skill level or above my magical pay grade. What would an expert on these topics do in this situation? You can kind of like sit down with me and pick my brain for an hour. Um, but the only people who are able to book magic like from me, like for me to do magic for you, are on my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Siri Vincent Plouff. And that's at the community supported magic level at $15 a month and above. And I explicitly make it that way, first of all, because, if I'm going to be messing around in your weird and all of that stuff, like, I want you to know what my context is, and I want to have a better idea of what your context is before we even enter into that kind of client relationship. Like, I will do divination for anyone, but like, if I'm explicitly doing magical workings on your behalf, like, I want to have a deeper, closer understanding of um, what's all gone down there. Um, and so yeah, that's probably like, I also just post like weird thoughts there too, and kind of like more personal writing. I have gotten a lot more critical about the kind of magical writing that I share, where I share that, particularly in the world of AI trawling. Um, you know, like if I put something out there on Instagram, it's because I know that it is being used for that at this point. Like there's just no way of um keeping that separate. So that's where some of my weirder work happens. It's on the Patreon, essentially.
Well, thank you again, Siri. And the book is Queering the Runes, coming out this November. Um,
Yes, should be the first week of November.
Alrighty, through Weiser, and that'll be available wherever books are sold. And this has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.